In the previous video, we've talked about that a queen cannot win against the bishop pawn if the king is next to the pawn on the 7th rank. This is also true only when the king is far away. Just a quick recap. If the queen attacks the king, let's say queen to e5, our goal is to run towards the square h8 because that will be a refuge for us since he cannot take the pawn. If he moves the king, let's say, we would move king g8, check, and then we could simply just run the corner. And if he checks us on g6, we could just run there. Taking the pawn will be stalemate, and black cannot make progress. And even if the queen checks us on a3 here, not allowing us to go to f8 and towards the h8 square, we could still get a draw, simply king e8 after check. Then we will be able to go towards that square and reach the drawing position. I do want to point out, if we go back to the beginning, to be very careful of the diagonal of the queening square. For example, if you're too eager to get your queen here, if you move the pawn to f8, he will be able to win with queen to a3 check. And now you cannot defend the queen anymore, so after you move away, he's going to be able to take the queen and win the game. Now these positions are not a draw if black's king is close to the pawn and he has the move. Now how close does he have to be? Well, first of all, there are two scenarios. It all depends where the white king is situated. The best scenario for white as defending here is to be on the g7 because he's just one move away from the square h8, which is his refuge. Here, if the white king is on g7, the critical squares are g6 and e7. The rule says that if black has the move and can step on the critical squares, either g6 or e7 in one move, then black can win the game. For those of you that are visual learners, you could see the diagram on the screen. So if black is in that diagram and has the move, he will be able to win. And maybe an even easier way to remember, and this is the way I remember it, I think that the two critical squares, e7 and g6, form one knight move together with the pawn and the king. And I know if I have the move and my king can step on those squares in one move, then I will be able to win this position. And the other scenario is when the king is on the other side of the pawn, meaning on the long side. Here the critical squares are d7 and g6. And the rule says that if the king can step on those squares in two moves and has the move, then he will be able to win. You could look at the diagram that's on the screen and you could think of the king being in that diagram. But from my experience, and I think an easier way to remember this, if you look at the queening square again, which is the square f8, both of the critical squares are a knight move away, both the d7 and the g6 square. So if you can step on those squares in two moves and you have the move, then you will be able to win. So let's take a look at all of these scenarios to see how we can win these type of games. Okay, in our first scenario here, the white king is on g7 and he's one square away from the refuge square h8. However, our king is one square away from the critical square g6. Therefore, we should be able to win. So what we want to do here is come with the queen to a7, taking control of the 7th rank. And here white has two options. He could go to g8, protecting the pawn, or he could run into the corner on h8. If he steps on g8, what we want to do is come and take the opposition. And after he queens, then we have checkmate in one move. Now, if he does get a knight here, we're still going to be able to win pretty easily after we move the king to h6. The only move that he has to still keep his knight is the knight to e6, but after we move the queen to e7, that knight is gone. The only square that he has to still keep his knight is f8, but then we have checkmate on g7. And if we go back to the beginning, instead of going to the square g8, what if he goes into the corner h8? Here we want to be careful. We do not want to be greedy. We don't want to take the pawn because this is stalemate. But all we have to do is still come with the king to g6. And after we come with the king to g6 and he queens, then we still got checkmate on h7. I also want to mention that if he runs the square h8, you do want to be careful not to step with the king on h6, because if you do that, this game is actually drawn now because he queens with check, and you have to move the king away, and now you won't be able to checkmate him anymore. In our next position, the white king is again on the short side and 1 square away from the refuge square h8, but the black king is 1 square away from the critical square e7, and we have the move, so we should win here again. The winning idea is coming with the queen to g2 and giving the white king a vertical check. Now here white has two main options. He can retreat to the h file, or he could retreat to the f file either on f8 or on f6. If he retreats to the h file either on h7 or h8, all we have to do is bring the king next to the pawn, and that pawn is ours. The white king has where to move, therefore even if he tries to get a queen, we're simply just going to take it and then win the game from here. If we go back from the beginning, if the white king moves to f8, then all we have to do here is come with the king to e6. And now white cannot get out on the g file because the queen has control of that file. So the only move he has is f8, in which we do have queen a8 mate. And if he goes to f6, what we want to do is bring our queen closer, queen to f3 check. He's going to move the king to g7, then could bring our king next to the pawn, and that pawn is ours. If he queens, we're simply going to take it as the king protects the queen, and all he has is king to h7, and then we will simply just win the game from here. In our next position, the white king is on the other side of the pawn, on the long side, and our king is 2 squares away from the critical square d7, which is a knight move away from the queening square f8. Therefore, having the move, we should be able to win. What you want to do in this type of position, first of all, you're trying to prevent the white king from reaching the square h8. And whenever he steps on f8, you want to make sure that you're able to block the g file, maybe with queen g6 or even queen g1, not to allow the white king to escape to his refuge square. And now from here, the white king will come to e7. Coming to e8, he's going to be pinned to the pawn, giving our king tempo to move closer to him. So, and when he comes to e7, we will be able to come to g7, pinning the pawn, also taking control of the 7th rank. And from here, white, all he has is king to e8, and now we will bring our king closer, and after he queens, we're going to have checkmate on d7. So let's see how we could reach this position. Starting from the beginning, the fastest way to achieve this, we want to start with queen to a3. This checks the white king, but also takes control of the f8 square, not allowing white to run towards the refuge square. So here, all he has is king to e8. And then we're going to check the king again on a8. He's going to move out to e7. And now we will be able to come with the queen to e4 check. After he moves the king to f8, trying to run to the refuge square, this is when we're going to come to g6, taking control of the g file, not allowing the white king to run towards his refuge square. And from here, white has only two options, either coming to e8 or e7. Best move for him is e7, and from here we're going to just pin the pawn. And after he moves king to e8, we're going to come to c6, and after he queens, we're going to checkmate on d7. Here he's going to move the king to e8 instead. Well, the pawn is pinned now, so that gives us a tempo to bring our king closer to him. And after he moves to e7, same idea, we're going to take control of the 7th rank. And now all he has is king to e8 if he wants to hold on to the pawn. And here we've got to be careful. We have to move to c7. After he queens, we are going to be able to checkmate on d7. If we come with the king to d6 instead, that would be a mistake because he will queen with check, and now if we move out of check, he's going to take our queen, and if we take his queen, he's going to be able to take it, and this will be a draw. Now, coming from the beginning, what if our king would have been on c5? Well, here we would not be able to check the white king on the diagonal, but we are still able to win in a different way. What we want to do here is queen to a7 check, and now he is going to be able to move to f8, but we are going to take control of the g file from g1. Now white still can't run towards the refuge square, and he's going to move to e8 to promote the pawn. But after this, we are going to pin the pawn on g6. If he moves to e7, we're going to pin it again on g7, also taking control of the 7th rank. And now after he moves the king to e8, we are going to be able to bring our king to c6. And after he queens, we're going to checkmate on d7. In our next position, white is again on the long side of the pawn, and we are 2 squares away from the critical square g6, which is a knight move away from the bishop square. Therefore, having the move, we should be able to win. The winning plan here is to force the white king on f8. That will give us a tempo to bring our king closer on g5. And after we move the king closer to g5, we want to make sure that after he moves the king to g8, we are going to be able to take the opposition. And we want to make sure that our queen covers the 7th rank, so that after he queens, we will be able to checkmate on h7. Or after he moves the king to g8, we want to be able to take the opposition. And after he queens, we want to make sure that we are able to check him on the white diagonal, because he will not be able to block the check with his queen, as we will be able to take it. And from here, if he moves to the corner, we have a nice maneuver with queen to h3 check, and after he moves to g8 back, we got queen to h7 mate. So let's take a look, starting from the beginning, how we can achieve this position. So what we want to do here is check the king on a7, and from here, white has 3 options. He could move the king to e8, he could run with the king to f8, or he could move the king to f6. If he moves the king to e8, what we're going to do is bring our queen closer, queen to b8, and then he's going to move the king to e7, then queen to e5. And now white has 2 options again. He could go to d7, move away from the pawn, or he could run to f8. If he goes to d7, then we're going to come with the queen to f6, attacking the pawn, so he's going to come to protect it. And now we're going to come with the queen to e6. Here, he's not going to be able to run away because he's going to lose the pawn, so he's forced to move to f8, and this gives us the tempo to bring our king closer to g5. And after he moves the king to g7, we're going to pin the pawn and also taking control of the 7th rank. So after he moves the king to g8, we are going to be able to bring our king to g6, taking the opposition, and after he queens, we're going to checkmate on h7. And if instead running to d7 he goes straight to f8, then we're going to use the same plan. We're going to bring our king closer on g5. After he moves the king to g8, we are going to bring our king to g6, taking the opposition. And after he queens, here we are going to be able to check on the white diagonal on e6. And like I said, he's not going to be able to block the check with the queen, as we will be able to take it. So his only other move is king to h8. And now we're going to do the nice maneuver, queen to h3 check. After he moves to g8, we got queen h7 mate. And going to the beginning, instead of moving king to e8, what if he runs to f8 right away? Well, we already have control of the 7th rank, so we're just going to bring our king to g5. And after he moves the king to g8, we're going to take the opposition. And after he queens, we got checkmate on h7. And his last scenario is moving his king to f6. Here we're going to just cover the queening square, moving the queen closer. After he moves to e7, we're going to come with the check on e5. And here the white king will probably go to f8. If he's going to run away on d7, we already saw that. We're just going to attack the pawn on f6. So if he moves to f8, we're going to bring our king closer. After he moves the king to g8, we're going to take the opposition. And after he queens, we're just going to check him on e6. Again, he's not going to be able to block the check. So after he moves king to h8, we're going to check him on h3 and then checkmate on h7. And in the end, I want to show you a quick trick that many great players, sometimes even masters, fall for. If we look at this position, the king is on the short side. Even though it's not on b2, he's on b1. He's on the short side. Therefore, we should be able to reach the critical squares b3 in one move or d2 in one move. Well, our white king is not able to reach those critical squares in one move. Therefore, this position should be a draw. But there is a nice trick here that we can try against our player if our player is not careful or has not studied this type of position. So what we want to do here is queen b3 check. After this, he could probably run into the corner, as we are not able to take the pawn, as that will be stalemate. And then we'll come with the queen to e3, covering the square c1, so not letting him queen. He's going to probably protect the pawn on b1. Then queen to e4, pinning the pawn again so he doesn't move. Here, if he brings the king to b2, we are going to be able to pin him on e2. And now here, if black moves his king to b1, he's actually going to lose this game now. What we're going to do is we're going to come with the king to c4, and after he queens, we're going to be able to take the opposition, and you could see our queen has control of the 7th rank, and there's nothing that black can do here to stop checkmate either on a2 or b2. Any queen move that he's going to make, we're just going to checkmate on the next move. What black has to do here, instead of coming to b1, which is a logical move, he has to just run into his refuge square, as we're not able to take that pawn because it will be stalemate. Another trick that we can try here, if our opponent keeps running into the corner, is queen to e1 check. And if he comes and protects the pawn on b2, we could try to pin him on d2. And now if he runs into the corner again, we are going to be able to win this game coming with the queen to c1 check. And now after he moves to a2, we are going to be able to win the pawn and then win the game. What black has to do instead, when we are pinning him on d2, he has to be careful not to run into the corner, but to move on b1 now, protecting the pawn. And from here, there's nothing that white can do to win this game. If we pin the pawn, now he's safe to move into the corner again. Okay, thank you for watching these videos. I encourage you to check out my website, masteryourchess.com, where you will be able to practice these type of positions and more.